very good morning to you all. You're watching World Talks here on TVP World, and I'm your host, Klaudia Czerwińska. Austrian president tasked the leader of the far-right Freedom Party with forming a coalition government. This adds to the wave of instability among governments of EU member states. As the EU Observer pointed out, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. Herbert Kickl, leader of the far-right Freedom Party, is on his way to become Austria's new chancellor and first far-right leader since the end of World War II. What comes next and what new troubles could this spell for the EU and Austria? Joining me now to discuss this is Partheymüller, senior scientist at the Vienna Center for Electoral Research at the University of Vienna. A very good morning, and thank you for joining me here on the program.
Good morning.
So as we're looking at the situation that's been unraveling over the last few days, is Austria slipping into the grip of the far-right government, and actually has it reached a point of no return?
Yes, so at this current point, a coalition with the far-right, led by the far-right, really seems to be the most likely and most viable option. Coalition talks between the mainstream parties, between the centrist parties, have failed on Friday and Saturday. And now this seems to be the only option on the table.
So this is the first time since World War II a far-right leader will take charge. What does this signal, and how could this coalition shape Austria and what's going to happen in the decisions that the government is going to make?
So what does it signal? First of all, it signals that the apparent claims that there's a concern about the far right among the center right are not as big as the concerns over policy in the economic domain. So during the campaign, the center right claimed that the far right would be very problematic in terms of liberal democracy and being a threat to liberal democracy and security of Austria. Now, however, they were unable to negotiate a deal, a compromise with the Social Democrats over economic issues. And now it seems that this has become more important to them than protecting democracy.
Mm-hmm. So the FPO's anti-immigration stance and Euroscepticism that's been shown before is going to influence the formation and the agenda of the new government. What are we to expect when it comes to policies, when it comes to immigration, for example?
So there's considerable overlap in terms of policy in the migration domain, but also in the economic policies between the center-right and the far-right. So both parties take a very critical stance on migration. The fight against political Islam has been announced as one central theme that they will pursue. In the economic domain, the main point is that there's currently a quite big hole in the budget, and both parties focus on rather cutting down on spending rather than new taxes. So so we can expect cuts on social policies, no new taxes, and a restrictive policy on migration.
What do you think is going to be the EU's response? We've already heard some voices when it comes to the relationship between Austria, as Austria seems to be shifting into this more of a far-right camp when it comes to its policies. What's the European response so far?
So far, the European response has been quite hesitant, and there has been little commentary on the situation. 25 years ago, when the FPO first entered the government as a junior partner, there was a huge outcry across Europe. But by now, the far-right policies have been fairly mainstream, and many countries now have far-right parties in the government. So in this sense, there's not so much of an outcry as there was 25 years ago.
Mm-hmm. We know that the party has more of a pro-Russian, more of a pro-Russian stance. We know that they're going to be at the helm. Do you think that we are actually going to see some developments in possibly days, weeks, and months to come, which are going to show this clearly pro-Russian stance?
I think that Austria has I think the Freedom Party has a more pro-Russian stance. They oppose the sanctions against Russia, the economic sanctions by the EU. Austria is a neutral country, so they are not so critical in terms of military support. So Austria has not played a vital role in this respect so far. So not much is going to change in that domain. But I think, yes, we will hear more critical stances towards the sanctions, more consensual approach with or a more open approach towards Russia. Yes, that is to be expected.
Considering the outcry, considering some of the public voices that were heard after the decision was made, what do you think are potential implications when it comes to democratic institutions and civil liberties in Austria?
I think that we will maybe see similar tendencies like in Hungary. So we have often seen that especially the media and journalism get under pressure in these kind of situations. So it will be quite interesting to see how things develop, in particular with relationships to the public broadcasters and so on. So yeah, we will see how resilient Austrian democracy is in such a situation.
When we're looking at the stance of the FPO, we mentioned the pro-Russian sentiments. We mentioned the Euroscepticism. You said that Austria, regardless of the situation, remains neutral. But do you think that there could be some sort of a foreign policy shift when it comes to the EU and when it comes to NATO? I mean, there's a lot on the table right now in Europe as we're looking at different sorts of elections. We're looking at the fall of some of the coalitions in different countries. Do you think that this stance is going to change somehow?
I think that the influence by Austria in the EU is rather small. I do think we will see a bit more of a critical course towards the EU. But I think that the influence is not so big that it will change the overall situation. We already had a number of governments that were, for example, opposed to sanctioning people in Georgia and so on. So we had already Hungary, we had already Slovakia, and now we will have maybe an Austrian government that will take a similar stance.
I mentioned that there was some outcry when it comes to the latest developments, but I wanted to take a look at a different side of this perspective, the different side of the coin. What would you say, what does it reflect when it comes to public sentiment that this party is actually managing to take over? We know that the election took place 100 days ago. But we are looking at a certain development that, for example, I don't think that the president himself, the Austrian president, actually anticipated.
The Austrian president tried to avoid doing this. The Austrian president first handed the negotiations to the second largest party, which is uncommon in historical patterns. Usually the largest party is the party supposed to negotiate a coalition. So the president used to be from the Green Party, so he has his also personal distance to the far right, and he really tried to avoid this situation. And in his statement yesterday, he also said that it was not an easy decision for him personally, and that he will continue to watch critically the situation to ensure that the constitution and the central pillars of the constitution will be maintained.
There's no easy way about it. I mean, looking at the historic associations, looking at the political associations of the Freedom Party, how do you think that the current political prominence will reflect the broader trends in European politics with everything that's been happening, something that I mentioned before in our conversation, with how far right seems to be gaining more power, but especially when we're looking at Austria, especially when we're looking at Freedom Party, what does it reflect?
Yeah, so Austria has been, to some extent, been an early adopter. The far right has been traditionally quite strong in Austria. Already, as I said, 25 years ago, the far right entered the government first time. And yeah, now we see them even taking the lead of the government. So I think that's also a new dimension that not all countries have experienced yet. And I think this trend will continue. We have seen the rise of the far right over multiple decades now. During COVID, it took a bit of a break, but we have seen the return of Donald Trump. We have seen the French far right being quite strong, and Austria now being another case of this. So it seems likely that this trend is going to continue.
And when do you think we're going to see some sort of policies materialize? How much time? What's the time scale that we're looking at when it comes to actually finding out what the FPO is really about?
So people say that the negotiations will not take that long, so they probably will try to form a government now pretty quickly, given that already 3 months have passed. And so we don't know for sure, but maybe it will be a couple of weeks or 1 month or something like that. So I think we will know quite soon where things are going.
And when we're looking at the lessons that Europe could potentially learn from the situation in Austria, what would be the biggest takeaways in your opinion?
I think that people have underestimated how difficult it can be to form compromise when parties in the center need to make policies across the aisles. So it can be quite difficult to bridge those gaps. And I think people have thought this would have been easier to find compromise in the center and to prevent such a situation by forming a coalition of 3 parties of the center. But this has turned out to be harder than expected, apparently. And I think people can learn from the situation that it can be a quite challenging aspect to form such coalitions.
And last but not least, in your assessment, what do you think are going to be the long-term consequences when it comes to Austria, when it comes to its social cohesion, when it comes to its democracy? How would you summarize that?
I think that the polarization in the society that has been already quite high will now grow even further. I think that the new chancellor will be a quite polarizing figure, and that we will see a lot of conflict and increasing distrust towards the government. So I think that is what we will see.
Thank you so much, Julia Partheymüller, senior scientist at the Vienna Center for Electoral Research at the University of Vienna. It's a pleasure to have you on the program. Thank you.
Thank you.
And so this would be all for now here on World Talks, but please do stay tuned as we have more coming up in just a moment.